Hey everyone, welcome back to English Factory. Today we're talking about how to disagree with someone without sounding rude. Most learners think if they disagree, they'll hurt someone's feelings, but that's not true. There are so many ways to express disagreement that are respectful and keep the conversation strong. So today we're going through 20 phrases that show you can have a different opinion without being mean. This is important because in real life, you'll encounter situations where you don't agree with someone, and you need to handle it gracefully. Let's start with understanding what disagreement actually means. When you disagree, you're saying your opinion is different from theirs. But here's the thing, disagreeing doesn't mean you're attacking them personally. It means you have a different perspective. The key is showing respect while expressing your viewpoint. If you just say, "You're wrong," people feel attacked. But if you say, "I see your point, but I think differently," the conversation becomes a discussion instead of a conflict. That's what makes the difference between sounding rude and sounding respectful. Here's the most common way. "I see your point, but..." This acknowledges their idea is valid, but then you introduce your own opinion. For example, someone says, "We should work late tonight," and you respond, "I see your point, but I think we'd be more productive if we started fresh tomorrow." You're not dismissing their idea. You're saying there's another way to look at it. When you lead with this, people feel heard. Now let's talk about "I understand where you're coming from, but..." This is softer and more empathetic. You're saying you understand their reasoning. Then you introduce your different view. For instance, someone says, "Online shopping is better," and you say, "I understand where you're coming from, but I prefer seeing things in person." You're validating their thinking while expressing yours. This phrase shows emotional intelligence. Here's one that's really effective. "I hear what you're saying, however..." You're acknowledging them but introducing contrast. You might say, "I hear what you're saying about traveling being expensive, however, I think the experience is worth the money." This phrase works well in professional settings or serious discussions. Let me give you, "That's one way to look at it, but..." This acknowledges their perspective as valid, just one option among many. For example, someone says you should always be honest, and you respond, "That's one way to look at it, but I think there's a difference between honesty and kindness." This opens space for a real discussion. Here's one that shows your thinking. "I disagree with you on that." This is direct and clear, but it's not aggressive. You might say, "I disagree with you on that. I think social media has more negative effects." By being direct but then explaining your reasoning, you're being honest and thoughtful. Now let's talk about "I don't think that's quite right." This is gentler than saying someone is completely wrong. It suggests there's inaccuracy without making the person feel stupid. Someone says, "The meeting is at 3 o'clock," and you respond, "I don't think that's quite right. I got an email saying it's at 2 o'clock. You're correcting them without making them feel bad. Here's one that's really polite. "I respectfully disagree." This phrase is formal and shows you're taking it seriously. You might say, "I respectfully disagree with your approach. I think we should try something different." This is great for professional environments. Let me give you, "That's not necessarily true." This challenges an idea without attacking the person. Someone says everyone hates Mondays, and you respond, "That's not necessarily true. Some people actually enjoy Mondays." It's a diplomatic way of disagreeing. Here's one that's really useful. I see it differently. This is simple and doesn't sound argumentative. You might say, I see it differently. I think the problem isn't the system, it's how we're using it. This phrase is neutral and invites discussion. Now let's talk about I had a different experience. This is perfect when you're disagreeing based on personal experience. Someone says that restaurant is always crowded, and you respond, I had a different experience. I went there last week, and it was quiet. This shows that experiences can be different. Here's one that's thoughtful. I think there's more to consider. This suggests their point has merit, but there are other factors. Someone says, you should always follow the rules. And you respond, I think there's more to consider. Sometimes rules need to be challenged if they're unjust. You're expanding the conversation. Let me give you, I'm not sure I agree with that. This is softer than I disagree, but still clear. You might say, I'm not sure I agree with that. I think we should get more opinions before deciding. This works well when you want to express disagreement without being too strong. Here's one that shows respect. I appreciate your opinion, but I think differently. This acknowledges their view and respects it, but you're introducing your perspective. You're not rejecting them. You're just sharing your own view. Now let's talk about let me offer a different perspective. This is less about disagreeing and more about introducing an alternative viewpoint. It sounds collaborative. You might say, let me offer a different perspective. Instead of cutting costs, what if we focused on increasing value? This makes the other person feel like you're working together. Here's one that's really diplomatic. I see what you mean, and I also think. This combines acknowledgement with your own view. Someone says work is more important than hobbies, and you respond, I see what you mean, and I also think balance is important. You're adding nuance to the discussion. Let me give you, I have to respectfully push back on that. This shows you disagree, but you're doing it respectfully. It signals an intellectual debate. You might say, I have to respectfully push back on that idea. I think the data shows something different. Here's one that's great in group settings. I hear what you're saying, and I think we should consider the other side too. This encourages balanced thinking. During a discussion, someone says, remote work is always better, and you respond, I hear what you're saying, and I think we should consider the other side too. Some people work better in an office. Now let's talk about I don't necessarily agree, but I understand your reasoning. This validates their logic while expressing a different conclusion. You might say, I don't necessarily agree, but I understand your reasoning. I just think the risks outweigh the benefits. People appreciate this because it's not dismissive. Here's one that's really effective. I think you make a good point, and here's what I'd add. You're building on their idea. Someone says exercise is important, and you respond, I think you make a good point, and here's what I'd add. Sleep is equally important. You're expanding the conversation. And finally, I appreciate you sharing that, but I have a different take. This is warm and respectful while being clear. Someone shares their advice and you respond, I appreciate you sharing that, but I have a different take on this. This maintains the relationship. So there you have it. 20 ways to disagree that sound respectful and thoughtful. The important thing is that these phrases separate the idea from the person. You're not saying they're wrong or stupid. You're saying you have a different perspective. When you use these, disagreements become conversations instead of conflicts. People feel heard and respected. That's what makes real communication work. Thanks so much for listening to English Factory. Subscribe for more practical English lessons and real conversation tips. See you next time.